Morning theology class. This is going to be your last video lesson for the year. Next week you're going to be working on a kind of a final assignment, which I will explain at the end of this video. This is our last lesson for the year in theology class, the week of May 11th through the 15th. As I said before, you're going to be writing what I'm calling a Theology of Work essay. There's no reading this week or next. Instead of a test this last quarter, what you're going to do is bring together the different strands of sort of a theology of work that we've talked about, the goodness of work, the brokenness of work, and the restoration of work. In God's kingdom, you're going to kind of bring all those together to reflect on your own work that you may get to do one day. So I'm going to talk through more of those details later on in this video. But this week, you have this video to finish, and then you have this essay to begin working on, and you have next week to finish that up as well. So this week, video and essay. Next week, which is the last week of school, essay only. And you're to get that to me by Thursday, May 21st at 3 p.m. Notice that that is a day sooner than usual. I didn't want you to have to turn something in on the last day of school there, graduation day. So that's due Thursday of that last week of school by 3 p.m. Let me know if you have any questions about those. Again, I'm going to get back to the details of that assignment toward the end of this video. Just a reminder of kind of where we've been, and just as a note on that assignment, these are the kinds of things that I'm inviting you to engage with as you write that will make more sense when we get there. Again, we've talked about some of the ways that people approach work that were twisted and broken and bent. We talked about how God made us to work. He's the great worker. All kinds of work participate in the grand drama of cultivating the earth, of turning it into a trophy case for God's glory. The two main kinds of work, or you might say functions of work, purposes of work, are cultivation and service. Making something of the world that God has given to us, advancing it, maintaining it, developing it, repairing it, but also work as service both to God and neighbor. And so God invites us into both of these activities, cultivating the earth and serving Him and our neighbor. Yet work is also broken by the fall. It becomes fruitless. The production of our work does not rarely matches the output and energy that we put into it. Work can become pointless, a seemingly mindless drone of laborious toil that doesn't seem to have an end to it. And often those two things are a reality because our work often becomes selfish, focused on ourselves, focused on creating a sort of a self-manufactured good life, comfortable life, cushy life for ourselves, rather than entering into work as cultivation and service. So what we're going to get to today is, how does the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, the love of God for sinners, how does that change our work? I'm making this video on Friday. I have no idea if you can hear those dings, but it's because you all are turning your work in the day that it's due. So forgive me for those. I'm assuming that it will not be a problem if I mute my computer, but I'm not going to risk it since I've never done that before while I've been recording one of these videos. So at any rate, we roll on. The gospel, how does it change your work? And we're going to talk about how the gospel gives us a new story within which to work, and a new power, kind of an underlying driving force that fuels our work. So this is our last video. I'm guessing that you're kind of bored of this format. You're bored of this subject. Let me invite you to kind of slap yourself in the face, slap yourself in the heart, pipe up. I think some of these concepts, most of which come from Keller, can transform the way that you look at the work you're going to do. So I invite you, I implore you, bring your heart into these ideas, and think about the work that you want to do through the lens of the gospel this week. All right? So our big idea is how on earth does the gospel matter for our work? What does the gospel have to do with 8 to 5 work each day? When you wake up and show up to school or work on a Monday morning, how does your belief in God actually affect your work? Will you think about that hard during the next half hour? Imagine a person who is headlong into their career. They're in their mid-30s, they're successful, and then suddenly and strikingly they become a Christian. How does their work change? Does it change at all? What would be different if they actually became a Christian? So our sort of working thesis here at the beginning is that becoming a Christian, more specifically experiencing the love of God, it does not stop our work, but rather it changes our relationship to work. It might be tempting to think this person would they need to shift to some more spiritual work. If they were a businessman or working on Wall Street or a doctor or something like that. They should probably do something more, quote, spiritual. But I hope that Dorothy Sayers disavows you of that approach to work, that there are, there's a spiritual level of work, pastors and missionaries, so on and so forth, and then there's sort of everybody else. That is not the way that God made us to function in His good world. We don't shift our efforts to more spiritual work, but rather the present work that we are in is now seen through a whole new lens, a whole new approach to working in the world. For the Christian, work becomes a calling, an office, if you will. Listen to Paul in Ephesians 6. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will, as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them. Stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. You see this calling concept in this passage, that every kind of work, here we're talking about, first century servants, but you can roughly translate that into your own work that you will do someday. Notice that though this bondservant is working for some kind of earthly master, Paul understands their work not principally or chiefly or fundamentally as work for a master, work for a boss, work for a teacher, but rather their work is for the Lord. They are bondservants of Christ. They're doing the will of God from the heart. They're rendering their service as a servant with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. Can you imagine what your senior year of school will be like if you work as unto the Lord and not to man, not to teachers, not to reputations, not to resumes, not to resumes, not to resumes, not to resumes. Don't work next semester, next year for your resume. By all means, make a resume, pursue college, and educate yourself for work in God's kingdom. Understand that a resume is necessary for that. And that's why Paul is saying, he's granting, yes, work for your master. Obey him with fear and trembling. But do it with this higher goal of service unto the Lord. So your work as a Christian is a calling from God to you. That's the big idea here at the front end. And I'm inviting you to think of your last year of school as practice for that. If you work for the resume next year, if you work for college next year, you're going to set yourself up to work after college or in college, but particularly after college, for yourself, for some selfish end. So I call you, I invite you to work, this little phrase in this passage, work unto the Lord. Work as to the Lord and not to man. Next year in your school, and indeed in college, and indeed in the work that you will do after college. Or perhaps the work that you're going to do straight out of high school. So, for the Christian, work becomes a calling. Work is a calling. That's something we've touched on already. Well, how does that? What does that have to do with the gospel? The big idea here is that the gospel, the good news of God's grace, it invites us, it calls us into the story of what God is doing in the world. May you be captured, may your imagination be captured by what God, the Almighty King of the universe, is doing in the world. It's so much bigger than my kingdom. It's so much bigger than your kingdom. It's so much grander and broader and more wonderful than just making money to live a good life, than raising a good family to be happy, healthy, fat, and wealthy. It's about God's redemption of all things. So, will you consider afresh for the next few minutes the story that God is authoring in the world? What we're going to talk about is the fact that God and the gospel give us a new story within which to work, and they give us a new power, injecting our work in the world with a new fervency, a new passion, a new delight. Think for a second about these versions of a story that you're probably familiar with. Little Red Riding Hood took some food to her grandmother, and they ate it. Is that a story? Well, you might say sort of, but you can tell there's something wrong with it. What's wrong with this story? Nothing really happens of great note. There's not any conflict. There's no intrigue, right? What's wrong with this one? Little Red Riding Hood was at her grandmother's house, but a wolf broke in and ate them both. Well, it's sort of a story, you could say, but it also seems to lack something. What does it lack? Well, it has plenty of conflict, but it has zero resolution. So, think upon the most basic elements of any good story. What makes a story a story? Proposed to you, I would say this is generally common knowledge. I think Keller works it out in his book pretty specifically, but he suggests that there are three elements to any good story, or a story in general for that matter. It must have an account of how life ought to be. It also must give an explanation of how life has got thrown off, what's gone wrong with that life as it should be. And then finally, it must offer some proposed solution as to what will put life right again, or it actually will tell you about that solution coming to pass. So how life should be, how life is thrown off, and the solution to put that life right again. And I would invite you to see that you and I are actually living these three things every single day. We are enacting a certain kind of story in our lives. Now, it may not be the biblical answers to these three concepts, these three realities, but you and I are sort of enacting, we're living, we're manifesting these three elements to a story every single day. We're actually sort of offering through the way we live kind of a demonstration of what we think life should be like. And we're showing and demonstrating what we think is wrong with the world. And we are living what we think is the solution to how to put that life right. Again, it's what theologians often call a worldview. It's like the spectacles through which you view the world. And it answers these three basic questions. What should human life in the world be like? What is wrong with the world? And what can be done to make it right? Think about how your work engages with these three questions. What should human life in the world be like? How does your work participate in that? What is wrong with the world? How does your work in some fashion contribute to an understanding of that question? And then what can be done to make it right? How does the work that you want to do someday fit into that question? There are plenty of bad answers to all three of these questions. And we're going to talk about what the biblical answers are to these questions, which you've been swimming in for years now, but we're going to visit them and are visiting them freshly with an eye toward the work that you're going to do. But first, think for a second about how some of the following people answer this question. What can be done to make the world right? What can be done to make the world right? Think of these people stereotypically. So not every case, but generalization. Your average RCS high school student on his or her worst day. What can be done? What's going to make the world right again? Well, it's going to be a little bit less homework. It's going to be a little bit more free time. It's going to be work that is more focused on your specific interest. Okay, I understand. I know you probably want to punch me in the face through the computer right now. I understand these are stereotypes, and this is the drum that I've been beating for years. But what I want you to see is that on our most disgruntled, complaining kind of day about the difficulties of school, we're actually kind of enacting a vision of the world, a story of the world, with an understanding to what needs to happen for the good life to come. What needs to happen for the world to be made right again? And sometimes we have rather small-minded, self-centered answers to those kinds of questions. So next time you see me, feel free to punch me in the face. Don't actually do that. Dominic, I'm sure, will actually attempt to do that next time he sees me. Please don't actually hit me in the face. But I understand sometimes you need less work to do. I know that weekends are refreshing in a certain kind of God-made way. I agree with that 100%. But I'm inviting you to see that often as a student, and indeed as any kind of thing, a mom, a worker, a manager, we live with sometimes an unbiblical vision of what really will make the world right again. How does a Marxist understand the answer to this question? What can be done to make the world right again? Well, what's wrong with the world is capitalism, or the economic majority, or those at the top of society. And so to make the world right for a Marxist, the playing field needs to be leveled. The means of production, the economic means ought to be in the hands of the people. That's what must be done to make the world right again, right? That is the Marxist answer to this question. Your average Southern member of the NRA. Liberals are wrong with the world and our rights. The NRA here is the National Rifle Association, right? Our rights need to be established for the world to experience the way that it ought to be. I'm not going to go through these, the rest of these. You can ponder them if you'd like. What I'm trying to get you to see is Each one of us, everyone, lives with a typically subconscious, implicit answer to these three questions, and especially this last one, right? What's wrong with how should the world be? What has gone wrong with it, and what can be done to make it right again, right? Each one of these angles on the world, if this is sort of your identity, if this is kind of who you are, singles out, at least on their worst day, stereotypically and generally. I should have put RCS teacher up here, right? If I had been a more honest, equitable RCS teacher, I would have put myself on here, right? I've got answers to these questions, right? Better students, less complaining students, right? Less grading, so on and so forth, more interest in the subject, all of those kinds of things. But what we do when we fit into those kind of identities is we sort of single out some aspect of creation and we make it the arch villain in the world. But the problem with that is that then our proposed solutions are also some other created thing. So here's how, I think this was Keller. I can't remember where I got this. I'm pretty sure it was from his book. Here's what we're getting at here. Outside of the true biblical worldview, we will demonize something that is not bad enough to explain the mess we are in. And we will idolize something that isn't powerful enough to get us out of it. Think about how these two concepts affect our work. We're all living a story with something that is demonized, that is the arch villain of our lives in the good life. And we're all living with something that is the hero, something that's going to fix it, something that's going to make it the good life again. But short of God and His story, the gospel of good news of what God is doing in the world, we're gonna only answer these questions at the level of the world, of earthly things. We're going to demonize something that's not actually the real problem, and we're going to idolize something that is not actually the real solution. So, how does the gospel dig into these three questions and give us a new story that frames our work? Let me remind you of what the gospel is. This comes from Keller. I invite you to let this capture your imagination, attach your work to this, hook your working life into the gospel. He says the gospel is the true story that God made a good world that was marred by sin and evil, but through Jesus Christ, He redeemed it at infinite cost to Himself, so that someday He will return to renew all creation, end all suffering and death, and restore absolute peace, justice, and joy in the world forever. That's the gospel, right? At its heart is the forgiveness of sins for sinners who will trust Him and His grace. And yet, it reverberates out into the whole world as God is redeeming all things, right? Our problems are not fundamentally located at the level of our circumstances and the systems of the world, but they're fundamentally located at the level of our relationship with God. But then the ripple effects of that are felt throughout the world. If we were together, this would be a good time to be together. I would point you to the back wall, to the beautiful art that is back there. Thank you, Emma. To the words on the back, creation, fall, redemption, restoration. This is the story of the gospel of what God is doing in the world. The world was good, the world is fallen, and the whole world is indeed being redeemed. So how on earth does this give us a framework for our work? How does this story begin to transform our work? Well, we have a vision of what the world should be like, right? The world that God made for us should be one where God is honored, where He is praised, exalted, thanked, glorified. When people experience good things, God is cherished, God is praised, God is honored. It's also a world where everyone has enough. There are no poor in God's designed world. Everyone has enough. As the Old Testament prophets say, everyone sits under their own vine and fig tree. Human flourishing is key in this vision of what the world should be like. God made humans to flourish in the world that He made, in mind, heart, body. In this world, this vision of what the world should be like, there are always multiple bottom lines, right? By bottom line, that's a business term that involves profit, right? What's above the line are your income minus your expenses, and then below the line, the bottom line is your profits. But in the world that God made, there are multiple bottom lines. Human flourishing, caring for people, serving our neighbor, and serving God are all bottom lines in a vision of what the world should be like. But we also understand the deepest problems in life begin with alienation from God, human sin, selfishness, idolatry. And so the Christian who works is going to filter their work through the lens of the deepest problems in life. We're going to understand that as we work, we need to give an account of our selfishness and idolatry. We need to work and produce things, services. The activities our work need to account for the selfishness and idolatry that all human beings are prone to. I remember the story about my friend interviewing for the sales job, and he was asked, to sell the interviewer this lamp. All right, sell me this lamp. And he first asked, well, tell me why you need this lamp. And what's underneath that is, a good salesman understands that he does not just want to sell as much as he possibly can so that he can have as much gain as he can. Rather, he or she understands that people are given to idolatry and selfishness. And he does not want to be in a job that simply feeds the world's idolatry. Think about how a rich understanding of really what's wrong with the world can actually transform and affect your worth, both with your work, with your understanding of your potential alienation from God, your sin, your selfishness and idolatry, but also everyone else's. And so we're invited into this new lens of looking at our work in the world. But perhaps most importantly, the Christian worldview understands that our work is a part of God's redemption of everything. And it becomes more and more fundamentally God-centered and for the sake of our neighbor. God is working through businesses, doctors, lawyers, teachers, farmers, plumbers, cleaners, garbage collectors, real estate agents, and 10,000 other occupations. God is working through all of these to redeem all things. So with an understanding of what the world should be like and the deepest problems in the world, what's gone wrong with the world, and what is to be done to fix what's wrong with the world, we have a new vision for work. We have indeed a new story for work. Secondly, not only do we have sort of a new narrative within which to labor, a new understanding of the world within which to do our work, but we also have a new power for work, a new passion for work, a new engine of our heart that drives our work. Think for a second about what Keller calls the work under the work, or the work beneath the work. Everyone is working with an underlying driving force. So as you reflect on perhaps the last few years of your schoolwork, or as you anticipate the work that you will do someday, or even as you may observe people around you that have worked for a long time, your parents perhaps, what is the work beneath the work for them? What is the work beneath the work for you? Often, because of our sin, the work beneath the work is a sense of self. It's to fulfill a sense of self through productivity, work, or perhaps to bring home a paycheck so that then I can enjoy real life. We talked a good bit about these things. But notice there's the engine that's fueling the work is a sense of self, or reputation, or a paycheck, or a vision of just kind of the enjoyment of real life. That there's something peripheral and far too secondary to the work that actually fuels the work. So there's this heartbeat, this work underneath the work that actually drives the work itself. What is that for you? What is that for the people around you that you see? Again, remember, becoming a Christian, experiencing the love of God, doesn't actually stop our work. It may not even changes the work that we do, but in fact, it changes our relationship to that work. The love of God actually has the power to transform the way that you work, the reason that you work. The love of God actually, it satisfies everything underneath the line in this little equation. The love of God, the gospel of God, your salvation actually, it fills in the work underneath the work. It gives us a freedom from our work that actually leads to freedom in our work. We actually become able to do our work without worshiping our work. We develop a new passion for working hard. Think about why most people work hard. Why do you and I work hard? Isn't it so often to get something? Perhaps it's to get a paycheck, or to get a grade, or to get our parents' approval, or to get a teacher's approval, or to get a reputation. We so often work hard for a subtle passion for some kind of self-fulfillment. May it not be so. That life is the anxious life. It's the toilsome life. It's the laborious life. It's the miserable life. It requires you to put on a smiling face, pull up your bootstraps, and just do work that you probably don't want to do. And that ends up happening because we are working underneath our work for some other end that's a peripheral, earthly, worldly, selfish end. But think about what the gospel does. God's grace through Jesus' sacrifice, it satisfies that deepest part of our soul that longs for fulfillment and pleasure and peace and joy. And it empowers us to work with a passion born out of selflessness as opposed to selfishness. Here's how Keller puts it. You are adopted into God's family, so you already have your affirmation. You are justified in God's sight, so you have nothing to prove. You have been saved through a dying sacrifice, so you are free to be a living one. You are loved ceaselessly, so you can work tirelessly from a quiet inner fullness. You have been given an untouchable, exceeding joy, so you do not have to work to craft a comfortable life for yourself. Doesn't that excite you? Doesn't that life engage you for your senior year of school? May May it capture your imagination for both school and your work. Why does school often, or perhaps sometimes, why does school sometimes feel so passionless? You know, it feels like often there's nothing in it for me. And dadgummit, I'm in it for me. I know this. I know this because it's true for me. It has been through much of my school life, and it often is true of my working life. School tends sometimes to feel so passionless because it doesn't seem like there's anything in it for me. Well, if the love of God becomes the heartbeat and the center and the joy of your life, if the love of God becomes the heartbeat, the center, the joy of your life, you won't have to show up to school needing pleasure and fulfillment. You won't have to show up to work needing pleasure and fulfillment. You will be able to work both in school and in your callings with passion for learning itself and for the work itself. Even if it doesn't appear to benefit you, you will be able to work and to learn as unto the Lord. May it be so. I pray that in this last week or two of school, and indeed in your next year of school, in your years of college, in your years of work, that you would hear the voice of God Almighty calling you to work for Him and not settle for some lesser end, some lesser pursuit. May it be so. Listen to the way that Matthew puts it, the words of Jesus to you and me. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. A yoke is a kind of a symbol of slavery and grinding toil. Think about how this can become the solution to our deep problems of weariness, of the chronic grind and the stress of our school and our work. Jesus is the only boss. This language comes from Keller. He's the only boss who will not drive you to the ground. He's the only master who will not require your best performance in order to be satisfied with you, because his work for you is finished. When the work underneath the work has already been accomplished by Jesus, all that is left to do is serve God in the work He has given us to do. The grace and love of God offer a deep and abiding rest for our souls. When we stop working and schooling for our sake, oh, how I long for us not to learn chiefly for our own sakes. That is to put the yoke of self-fulfillment on your neck and to toil. When we stop working for our sake, we will be freed to work for the work's sake, for others' sake, and ultimately for God's sake. And then you and I can truly think of the work that we have to do today as service unto the Lord. May it be so for you all. Thus ends theology class for your high school career. To finish, I would like to kind of talk you through what you are to do this last 2 weeks. Instead of a test, again, you're going to do a little bit of writing to draw together some of these concepts in view of the work that you want to do someday. So your final assignment for this unit will be to bring together the various theological, biblical strands concerning work. The prompt is very simple. Describe a biblical theology of your future work. Describe a biblical theology of your future work. Your essay should address at least 3 aspects of biblical work, and they ought to be at least somewhat specific to your particular work, as much as possible. The design, these are the 3 aspects. The design, inherent goodness of your work. What is good about your work? How does it contribute to the world? How does it fit into the design of the world that God made? What's good about it? The brokenness of work. How is your work twisted? I know some of these things we've touched on in some of the things you've written, but here we're kind of drawing them all together. How does your particular work experience the brokenness of the fall? Think of the fruitlessness, the pointlessness, the selfishness, so on and so forth. And then how is your work being redeemed through the gospel? Or how does the gospel transform the work that you want to do? What does the love of God have to do with your work? And how is it contributing to the redemption of all things? So you should seek to incorporate as many of the concepts discussed this quarter in class as you can. You may refer to that list back at the beginning of each lecture to kind of jog your memory. There were 8 or 9 things on there. You don't necessarily need to hit every aspect of everything, but I expect you to heavily depend on class material. If you know what work you'd like to do in the future, then you should write in consideration of that particular kind of work. If you do not really have a clue what you want to do, try to consider something you may be interested in. This does not fix you, for some job. It's not setting that in stone, but try to think of something you might be interested in. Even if you're not certain what you want to do, but perhaps have an inclination or maybe even a dream job, feel free to reflect on that, even if it is not certain. To help you along, kind of use the following questions, not so much as a bullet point list. I want you to write an essay that's organized, has several points, and so on and so forth. But you can use these kind of as food for thought to get your creative juices flowing. How does your work fit into God's design for the world? How does your work reflect and imitate God Himself? How would you explain the dignity of your work to someone who isn't familiar with it? What kind of cultivation does your work engage in? What kind of service does your work give to the world and its people? What are some false motivations a person might have in your line of work? What are some particular ways your work experiences the brokenness of the fall? How would a selfish worker do their work in your field? How do God and the gospel give new meaning to the work you will do? If you wake up satisfied in God's love each and every day, what kind of worker will you be in this field? You can engage with some of those questions specifically. Don't just work through them bullet point but use them to kind of inspire your thinking about your job and a biblical theology of work, its design and goodness, its brokenness, and how God is using your work and using you to make all things new. This should be 2 pages long, 12-point font, double-spaced, have 1-inch margins. It's obviously somewhat reflective in nature as well. Give me the info that Mr. Dale requires in the top left corner. Do not give me any extra deceptive spaces. That's silly and dishonest. Give me 2 pages. If you can't write that much, then you haven't thought deeply enough about it. You'll be graded based upon your essay's depth and thoughtfulness, its use of class concepts and material, whether or not you answer the prompt, and general formatting and grammar. You have 2 weeks to do this. It's due, again, that last Thursday by 3 p.m. You have this week and next to do it. There is no video for next week, although I will send you an email reminder to keep you on task with this. I hope it is meaningful to you to think through some biblical concepts with regard to your work. I love you all. I hope that you've learned a little bit of something in theology class this year, and specifically to this last quarter. May you hear the call of Jesus Christ deep in your soul. Come follow me. Join him in the grand redemption of all things. I love you all. Let me know if you have any questions.